Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with a treasury of common sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Hello, Leith. How are you?
Yeah, g'day, Phil. How's things?
Good. Is there any common sense with Australia's rental crisis? Because it's definitely worsening.
Oh, it is. Unfortunately, it is. So there's a research outfit, a property research outfit called PropTrack, and they released their rental affordability report for the December quarter. And what it showed is that Australia's rental affordability has collapsed to a record low at the end of last year. So what it showed is that households earning a median income, which is roughly $116,000, could afford to rent the smallest share of properties in at least 18 years,
Wow.
which is basically when records began. So it could be a lot longer than that, but PropTrack's been collecting data for 18 years.
Yep.
And rental affordability is worse than it's ever been in that period. And the way that PropTrack works it out is they work out what the median income is, and they say, okay, if you're going to spend 25% of your median income on rent, how many properties could you afford?
Right.
And it showed that only 36% of rentals advertised on realestate.com.au.
How many?
36%.
Is that all?
Yeah, across Australia were affordable to the median income household if they didn't want to spend more than 25%, which is what PropTrack says is an affordable metric.
Right.
And obviously the key factor behind the massive decline in affordability is the surge in rents that we've had since the pandemic. So according to PropTrack, rents nationally have increased by 48% since the beginning of the pandemic.
Wow.
And that compares to 19% rise in median household incomes over that period. So obviously rents have risen a lot faster than incomes.
Well and truly, yeah.
And PropTrack's use median income here, so they've just grabbed the median household income for Australia. But it's that the situation is actually worse for renters because renters tend to be lower income earners, and more than half of renter households, or 58%, earn less than the median income. So what it means is that if you're a median renter household in Australia, you earn $101,000 rather than $116,000 for the median Australian, and that means you could only afford 19% of rentals.
19, geez, it's shrinking,
19%.
Isn't it?
It is. It's shocking, and unfortunately, it's New South Wales and Queensland are actually worse than the national average. So the rental affordability, lowest on record, 36% affordable nationally, but in New South Wales, it's only 26%
So
of rentals.
what's driving this then?
Well, it's because rents in Sydney are actually the most expensive in the nation. So according to PropTrack, the median rent for a Sydney house was $780 in the fourth quarter, and it's $700 per unit. So it's incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
And weekly rents in both Sydney and Brisbane have both increased by $230 since the start of the pandemic. Now, that's a $12,000 a year increase in rents if you're a median person living in Sydney or in Brisbane, which is an absolutely unbelievable hit. $230 a week coming out of your pocket. And I can guarantee you, Phil, very few people's incomes have gone up by that much. And Queensland's also got really poor affordability. So I just mentioned that New South Wales, only 26% of rental properties are affordable to people living in New South Wales. In Queensland, it's 28%. And both of those are worse than the national average of 36%. So New South Wales, Queensland getting hit even harder.
Yeah.
And I'd argue that the main factor that's driven the rental surge over the last couple of years has been the historically high net overseas migration that we've gotten. So in the first 2 years of the Albanese government, we saw 1 million net migrants arrive in Australia, which is unbelievable. It's actually more than that now, but the records are in the ABS are about 6 months behind. And that has obviously added a huge amount of people needing accommodation, and we haven't built enough homes, and that's been the main driver behind the surge in rents. And unfortunately, the pressure cooker situation is projected to continue because the Australian Treasury Centre for Population just in December projected that Australia's population is going to grow by 4.1 million people over the next decade on the back of ongoing high migration. And most of that population growth is going to occur in the major cities. So according to the Centre for Population, Sydney is projected to add 900,000 people over the next decade, and Brisbane is going to add 500,000 people. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to notice that if you if you're going to increase Sydney's population by 900,000 and Brisbane's by 500,000 in a decade, you're going to ensure that rental demand continues to outstrip supply, and you're going to place upward pressure on rents and obviously downward pressure on rental vacancies. So it's going to be a lot harder to find a rental property if Australia's population keeps growing this aggressively. And unfortunately, I think the number one solution is rental crisis, Phil, is we've got a slow population growth, we've got a slow immigration, because you can't, continue to import hundreds of thousands of people every year into a market that is supply constrained, whereby we can't build enough homes or infrastructure to support the extra people coming in.
Yeah.
So the obvious solution is we've got to cut it back. And unfortunately, the Australian Treasury's own population projections say that we're going to add nearly a Canberra, 410,000 people nationally every year for the next 10 years. So we've got to build basically a Canberra's worth of housing every single year to keep up, and we just can't do it.
No, it seems to be less a case of supply and demand and more a case of demand for a complete lack of supply. And I'd also hazard a guess that median rent for Sydney, because I live in Sydney, I can't speak for Queensland or even for the ACT, but I think $780 for a house in Sydney, that is at the lower end of the scale, because I don't think, you would really, and this is just Pete speaking as somebody that's trying to find a place to live, $780 for a house. I think it's more likely going to be $1,000 for a house, and also $700 for a unit. I think, again, it's a lot more than that. I think you're looking at more $850. I know you said that's the median rent, and I'd be interested to see what people think about that as well by way of the phone, 131-873, or you can text us as well. I think we'll find that people are paying a lot more than that for rentals.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously it's a median figure. So that takes into consideration people living, way out on the fringe or in one-bedroom apartments, tiny little shoeboxes, bed sits, all that sort of thing.
I'm even taking that into account, to be honest with you, Lee.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same, I live down in Melbourne, and it's cheaper down here. But obviously, if you live in anywhere that's sort of semi-inner suburb, you pay a hell of a lot more than the median. And I imagine in Sydney it's exactly the same. It
is. And what madness is this, where the Australian dream now is, can I afford to rent a one-bedroom flat close to the city? It's crazy.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that's going to be the future, Phil. I mean, the federal government, so the intergenerational report, which is released by the Australian Treasury every 5 years, that predicts that Australia's population is going to grow by another 13 million people over the next 38 years from now. Now, that is equivalent to adding another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane to Australia's population in just 38 years. Now, what that means, and the Urban Task Force released some projections for Sydney, and what it showed is that as of the 2016 census, so we're going back a few years, but about 56% of Sydney's housing stock was detached houses. And what it showed is that by 2057, the Urban Task Force projected that only 1/4 of Sydney homes will be detached houses, and 50% will be apartments, and 25% townhouses. So, what this effectively means is if Sydney grows to 8.5 million people, as projected by about 2060, you're going to have you're basically going to be forced to live in an apartment, and only a bit of uber wealthy that can afford to live in a detached house, and that's the future we're facing if the federal government continues to run this extreme immigration policy and grows Sydney to 8.5 million people, grows Melbourne to 9.5 million people, and grows Brisbane to nearly 5 million people. This is the future that we're facing, and is it a future we want?
That's right, something for somebody to step up and discuss as a policy in the upcoming election. Can I get you to hang around a sec, because there's another big story, and I guess you can probably guess what I'm going to ask you, you being an economist. Can you hang around and we'll talk about that after this?
Yeah, sure, Phil.